Mantras of our Divine Mother. Our Divine Mother says at every moment one must know how to lose everything in order to gain everything, to shed the past as a dead body and be reborn into a greater plenitude. With my love and blessings, says our Divine Mother. Words of our Lord Sri Aurobindo from the collective works of our Lord Sri Aurobindo, Volume 13, Book Essays on the Gita. Subtopic: The Message of Gita. The core of the Gita's meaning. Page 557, last line. Our Lord Sri Aurobindo says, it is not by insisting on this or that side only of the truth that you can practice in this integral yuga. The divine whom you have to seek, the self whom you have to discover, the supreme soul of whom your soul is an eternal portion, is simultaneously all these things. You have to know them simultaneously in a supreme oneness, enter into all of them at once and in all states, and all things see Him alone. If we were solely the spirit, mutable in nature, there would be only an eternal and universal becoming. If you limit your faith and knowledge to that one aspect, you will never go beyond your personality and its constant changeful figures. On such a foundation, you would be bound altogether. You would be bound altogether in the revolutions of nature. But you are not merely a succession of soul movements in time. There is an impersonal self in you which supports the stream of your personality and is one with God's vast and impersonal spirit. And incalculable beyond this impersonality and personality, dominating these two constant poles of what you are eternal and transcendent in the eternal transcendence. If again there were only the truth of an eternal impersonal self that neither acts nor creates, then the world and your soul would be illusions without any real basis. If you limit your faith and knowledge to this one lonely aspect, the renunciation of life and action is your only resource. But God in the world and you in the world are realities. The world and you are true and actual powers and manifestations of the Supreme. Therefore, accept life and action and do not reject them. One with God in your impersonal self and essence, an eternal portion of the Godhead, turn to Him by the love and adoration of your spiritual personality for its own infinite. Make of your natural being what it is intended to be, an instrument of works, a channel, a power of the divine. Our Lord Sri Aurobindo says that it always is in its truth, but not unconsciously and imperfectly through the lower nature, doomed to a disfigurement of the Godhead by your ego. Make it consciously and perfectly and without any distortion by ego, a power of the divine in his supreme spiritual nature and a vehicle of his will and his works. In this way, you will live in the integral truth of your own being and you will possess the integral God union, the whole and flawless yoga. Our Lord Sri Aurobindo says, the Supreme is the Purushottama, eternal beyond all manifestation, infinite beyond all limitation by time or space or causality or any of his numberless qualities and features. But this does not mean that in his supreme eternity, he is unconnected with all that happens here, cut off them from world and nature, aloof from all these beings. He is the supreme ineffable Brahman. He is impersonal self. He is all personal existence. Spirit here and life and matter, soul and nature, and the works of nature are aspects and moments of his infinite, eternal existence. He is the supreme transcendent spirit, and all comes into manifestation from him and of his forms and his self powers. As the one self, he is here all pervasive and equal and impersonal in man and animal and thing and object and every force of nature. Our Lord Sri Aurobindo says, he is the supreme soul and all souls are tireless flames of this one soul. All living beings are in their spiritual personality deathless portion of the one person or Purusha. He is the eternal master of all manifested existence, Lord of the worlds and their creatures. He is the omnipotent originator of all actions, not bound by his work, and to him go all action and effort and sacrifice. He is in all, and all are in him. He has become all, and yet, too, he is above all, and not limited by his creations. He is the transcendent divine. He descends as the avatar. He is manifest by his power in the vibhuti. He is the Godhead secret in every human being. All the gods whom men worship are only other personalities and forms and names and mental bodies of the one divine existence. Our Lord Sri Aurobindo says, the Supreme has manifested the world from his spiritual essence and in his own infinite existence and manifested himself too variously in the world. All things are his powers and figures, and to the powers and figures of him there is no end, because he himself is infinite. As a pervading and containing impersonal self-existence, he informs and sustains equally and without any partiality, preference, or attachment to any person or thing or happening or feature all this infinite manifestation in time and the universe. Our Lord Sri Aurobindo says this pure and equal self does not act but supports impartially all the action of things. And yet it is the Supreme, but as the cosmic spirit and the time spirit who wills and conducts and determines the action of the world through his multitudinous power to be, that power of the spirit which we call nature. He creates, sustains, and destroys his creations. He is seated too in the heart of every living creature, and from there, as a secret power in the individual, no less than from his universal presence in the cosmos, he originates by force of nature, manifests some line of his mystery in quality of nature, and in executive energy of nature, shapes each and everything and being separately according to its kind, and initiates and upholds all action. It is this transcendent first origination from the Supreme and this constant universal and individual manifestation of Him in things and beings which makes the complex character of the cosmos. Our Lord Sri Aurobindo says there are always these three eternal states of the divine being. There is always and forever this one eternal, immutable self existence, which is the basis and support of existent things. There is always and forever this spirit, mutable in nature, manifested by her as all these existences. There is always and forever this transcendent divine, who can be both of these others at once, can be a pure and silent spirit, and at the same time the active soul and life of the cycles of the universe, because he is something other and more than these two, whether taken separately or together. Our Lord Sri Aurobindo says, in us is the Jiva, a spirit of this spirit, a conscious power of the Supreme. He is one who carries in his deepest self the whole of the immanent divine, and in nature lives in the universal divine, no temporary creation, but an eternal soul acting and moving in the eternal self, in the eternal infinite. This conscient soul in us can adopt either of these three states of the spirit. Man can live here in the mutability of nature, and in that alone, ignorant of his real self, ignorant of the Godhead within him, he knows only nature. He sees her as a mechanical executive and creative force, and sees himself and others as her creations, egos, separated existence in her universe. It is thus superficially that he now lives, and while it is so, and until he exceeds this outer consciousness and knows what is within him, all his thought and science can only be a shadow of light thrown upon screens and surfaces. This ignorance, says our Lord, is possible, is even imposed, because the Godhead within is hidden by the veil of his own power. His greater reality is lost to our view by the completeness with which he has identified himself in a partial appearance with his creations and images, and absorbed the creative mind in the deceptive workings of his own nature. And it is possible also because the real, the eternal, the spiritual nature, which is the secret of the things in themselves, is not manifest in their outward phenomenon. The nature which we see when we look outwards, the nature which acts in our mind and body and senses, is a lower force, a derivation, a magician who creates figures of the spirit but hides the spirit in its figures, conceals the truth, and makes men look upon mass, a force which is only capable of a sum of secondary and depressed values, not of the full power and glory and ecstasy and sweetness of the manifestation of the divine. This nature in us is a Maya of the ego, a tangible of dualities, a web of ignorance and the three gunas. And as long as the soul of man lives in the surface, fact of mind and life and body, and not in the self and spirit, he cannot see God and himself and the world as they really are, cannot overcome this Maya, but must do what he can with its terms and figures. Our Lord Sri Aurobindo says it is possible by drawing back from the lower turn of his nature in which man now lives to awake from this light that is darkness and live in the luminous truth of the eternal and immutable self existence. Man then is no longer bound by his own narrow prison of personality, no longer sees himself as the little I that thinks and acts and feels and struggles and labors for a little. He is merged in the vast and free personality of the pure spirit. He becomes the Brahman. He knows himself as one with the one self in all things. Our Lord Sri Aurobindo continues to say, he is no longer aware of ego, no longer troubled by the dualities, no longer feels anguish of grief or disturbance of joy, is no longer shaken by desire, is no longer troubled by sin or limited by virtue. Or, if the shadow of these things remain, he sees and knows them only as nature working in her own qualities and does not feel them to be the truth of himself in which he lives. Nature alone acts and works her mechanical figures, but the pure spirit is silent, inactive, and free. Calm, untouched by her workings, it regards them with a perfect equality and knows itself to be other than these things. This spiritual state brings with it a still peace and freedom, but not the dynamic divinity, not the integral perfection. It is a great step, but it is not the integral God knowledge and self knowledge. Our Lord Sri Aurobindo says, a perfect perfection comes by living in the Supreme and the whole Divine. Then the soul of man is united with the Godhead, of which it is a portion. Then it is one with all beings in the self and spirit, one with them both in God and in nature. Then it is not only free but complete, plunged in the supreme felicity, ready for its ultimate perfection. He still sees the self as an eternal and changeless spirit, silently supporting all things. But he sees also nature no longer as a mere mechanical force that works out things according to the mechanism of the gunas, but as a power of the spirit and the force of God in manifestation. He sees that the lower nature is not the innermost truth of the Spirit's action. He becomes aware of the higher spirit nature. He becomes aware of a higher spiritual nature of the divine in which is contained the source and yet to be realized greater truth of all that is imperfectly figured now in mind, life, and body. Arisen from the lower mental to this supreme spiritual nature, he is delivered there from all ego. He knows them, he knows himself as a spiritual being. In his essence, one with all existences, and in his active nature, a power of the one Godhead and an eternal soul of the transcendent infinite. He sees all in God and God in all. He sees all things as Vasudeva. He is delivered from the dualities of joy and grief, from the pleasant and the unpleasant, from desire and disappointment, from sin and virtue. All henceforth is, to his conscious spirit and sense, the will and the working of the divine. He lives and acts as a soul and portion of the universal consciousness and power. He is filled with the transcendent divine delight, a spiritual ananda. His action becomes the divine action, and his status the highest spiritual status. We'll continue.
वन्दे सूर्यशशाङ्कवह्निनयनं वन्दे मुकुन्दप्रियं वन्दे वरदं वन्दे शिवं वन्दे श्रीअरविन्दम् तस्मात् तमेव मम शरणम् तस्मात् तमेव मम शरणम्